Welcome to Between the Covers, the show for readers and writers and lovers of books. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a publisher at Red Penguin Books, where we publish books of all types and genres. So if you're an author who has a manuscript all ready to go on your computer, or maybe it's still in your head, or maybe even 300 sheets of loose leaf shoved in a drawer. Yes, we get envelopes full of loose leaf every week. So just visit us at redpenguinbooks.com and unleash your inner author. I am so thrilled that tonight we're joined by three authors who have completely unleashed themselves. Uh, Danny Ingellis wrote Deferred Glory, Heroes of the Negro Baseball Leagues. And this is such a great time for this book, shining a light on all of these superstars that you may not have heard of, but who are now breaking the records. And Vanessa Mariah is the author of If a Kid Were President. Sometimes I think we'd be much better off if a kid were president. And I see from her smile, she agrees with me on that one. So we'll hear all about that. And I'm thrilled that J.D. Cunegan's book, The Art of Reading, How Reading Can Help You Become a Better, More Productive Writer. He's in good company because Stephen King has said, if you want to improve your writing, read more. So we're going to hear all about that. But we'll start by introducing Danny Ingellis, author of Deferred Glory, Heroes of the Negro Baseball Leagues. Danny, thanks so much for joining me.
Very happy to be here again,
Thrilled
Stephanie.
to have you. Thrilled
Yeah,
to have you. Tell me a little bit about, I know the backstory of your book, but tell our viewers how you even got started with writing this book, how you got interested, how you got inspired, and who was along this journey with you.
yeah. As Stephanie said, I'm a rookie. It's my first time ever publishing a book, and it came about not by chance, but I kind of say to myself, luck, but it's not a happy luck. I befriended a man by the name of Andy Mealy many years ago. Andy was a writer of about 5 books in sports, and also he wrote a book on the Italian Squad. And the Italian Squad was a book about the police department, NYPD, who had a squad that investigated the Black Hand, which was prior to the mafia. Andy's grandfather was part of that squad, and it was commanded by a commanding officer, legendary Joe Petrosino, who is the only man in NYPD killed in the line of duty out of the country. Now, I take a special interest in that because I was a detective for 30 years in NYPD. But getting on back to Andy, Andy asked me to research some of his books, and I did research them, and I'm also a freelance photographer. So I took a lot of photographs that appeared in Andy's books. And one day he said to me, you know, Danny, I'm going to want to do a research papers on the 3 Black men that live in Staten Island that played in the Negro Leagues. Those 3 men, 2 of which I knew, Sonny Logan, Glenn Mosley. I did not know Julie Bowers because he passed away in 1977. So I researched it, and I finished the research, and I call Andy up. Now, this is just prior to the pandemic. I call him up, and he says, how you doing? I said, I'm all finished with the research of the 3 guys. How about if I drop it off to you? He says, yeah, drop it off tomorrow. So I said, okay. Andy doesn't live far from me, maybe 2 miles. Well, tomorrow came, but before I left my house, I get a phone call from Andy's daughter, Christine, telling me Andy had to go into the hospital. Now, Andy's 80 years old, and he did have a heart problem. She said, Danny, please call Dad up. Said, he'd love to hear from you. He's down on the dumps. So I call him up, and he says to me, I'm all right. He says, drop those papers off. I'll be home tomorrow, probably. So I said, all right. I said, I'll drop them off. So I did take them and put them in his mailbox. He did not want to meet me because of the pandemic. So he got the papers, and I called him the next day, and he informs me, he says, wow, you did a great job. And his intentions were to put it in the local newspaper, the Staten Island Advance, all three of those men in separate editions. So he said, I'll get to it in a few days. Well, the next day, I get a phone call from Christine again that Andy's in the hospital again. And she asked me to call him, and I immediately called him. When I got on the phone with him, I knew right then and there things were not good. I didn't stay on the phone long. All I said to him, Andy, I started researching the Negro League players like you had asked me a few weeks ago. I says, and I'll get back to you in a few days. Oh, I'm going to be out of the hospital in 2-3 days. I said, okay. Well, the next day, I think it was August 8th, I get a phone call from Christine that her dad passed away during the night in the hospital. I was devastated. Till this day, I'm getting choked up just talking about it. But till this day, I miss the man tremendously because we were both baseball nuts. He was a big Dodger fan, and I'm a big Yankee fan. Almost was a Yankee myself out of high school. And so I go to his wake, and I went to the funeral. And after the funeral, I go home, and I'm sitting there. After about a week, I says, you know, I did all this research. What the heck am I going to do with this? I said, I can't let this go to waste. So I call up two of my friends who work in the Advance, and I tell them what I have, and they took the three Negro players and they put them in the newspapers. Then I told them I have almost finished reading 9 books on 35 Negro players that got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame from 1971 to 2006. There was 35, and I don't want to say men because there weren't 35 men. There was one woman, Effa Manley. So I said to myself, God, I got to put this pen to paper. And I asked a few guys that I knew were authors, and my best friend, Jay Price, who reviewed my book, he said to me, Danny, come on, you could write it, do it. So I sat down, and for 2 months, I read it, ripped it up, read it again, gave it to 3 guys to read. And lo and behold, one day I contact Stephanie, and she said to me, send the manuscript to me. And voila, became Deferred Glory.
What?
And
What an inspiration for people, how you channeled, you know, what you wanted to do for your friend and channeled your research and the pandemic, and wow.
Yeah. And I honored the book to Andy. On one of the pages, I put the last verse on that page is, Andy, this book's for you. Yep. And I truly mean it, because without him, this book would have never gotten done, because the idea wasn't mine. It was totally his. I just did the research for it. Well, and it was a lot of work, but the idea came from Andy. So this book is dedicated to him, and the rest is whatever it is. I'm thankful to Stephanie, and I'm thankful for the people that have purchased the book so far, whoever they may be.
Well, tell us a little bit about what, you know, in a nutshell, you know, 70 years of baseball history. Who are these people? Why weren't they in the major leagues? And maybe even what has happened recently?
Okay. Right on the cover of the book, there is a plaque. And that plaque is of Satchel Paige. Now, I don't know if JD or Vanessa even know who Satchel Paige is, but he was a fantastic Negro baseball pitcher back in the 1900s, the early 1900s. Well, he was the first Negro League baseball player inducted into the Hall of Fame. And it's sad because from 1971, it took until 2006 to put in 34 other guys and a lady. And I said to Stephanie one day, and in doing my research, racial prejudice comes into play. There's no doubt in my mind, because 1993, they inducted 3 guys. From 1993, there wasn't another induction until 2006. They inducted 17 guys and Mrs. Manley in 2006 on one day. It wasn't spread out in 2006. It was done in one day. And from 2006, it's now 2021. No one has been inducted. And I have inquired, and I had brought it up to Stephanie, I have inquired to 3 people who are influential in that Baseball Hall of Fame. And sad to say, none of those 3 people have answered my question. And my question to them is only one word: why? And they haven't answered me. And these are prominent people in the Hall of Fame. They're not dishwashers or porters. They're presidents and ilk like that.
Well, I'm thrilled you wrote this so that more people can learn about these gentlemen and women and learn more about this piece of history that so many people didn't even know about.
No, they didn't. And it just recently, it came about 2 months ago. The Major League Baseball finally recognized these gentlemen and lady from 1928 only to 1950. Why they didn't go beyond? Because the Negro League actually ended in around 1964, but they took all the records from 28 to 1950, and they are now part of Major League Baseball, which you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, for argument's sake, I'm sure you heard of Ted Williams, you two. Ted Williams was the greatest batter in baseball. He hit 406, the highest ever in major leagues batted. Well, he was the highest until 2 months ago, because there's a Negro guy, he's dead now, Josh Gibson, who hit 408. And that record now replaces Ted Williams. So it's records like that that should have been taken into consideration for these guys. And most of them, if not all of them, should have been in the major leagues. And it's because of racial prejudice. It took all them years to get Jackie Robinson in there in 1946. And then after that, slowly but surely, they started letting blacks in. But in 1946, these guys were either too old or they were dead.
Right.
And the sad part is, out of all these 35 people that were inducted into the Hall of Fame, only 6 of them were alive to realize that accomplishment. And one man, Leon Hill, was on his deathbed in the hospital when he got notified. So technically he was in a comatose state, but he realized, he told his wife he understood. Right. And he passed away hours later. And he was a fantastic ball player. He and Bob Feller, who is in the major leagues, Leon Hill never made it into the major leagues. Leon Day, I'm sorry. They're the only 2 guys that had no hitters on opening day of baseball. So on opening day in the Negro leagues, he had an opening day no hitter, and so did Bob Feller in the major leagues. Well, so there's a bit of history there, and I hope anybody that's read it or does read it enjoys it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And such an important book for people to be able to read and learn more about because it's a tragedy. You're absolutely right that
Yep.
it's not more well known. Our next author, Vanessa Mariah, wrote If a Kid Were President, all about what would be different. Maybe some of the things are more fun. Maybe they have unlimited ice cream going on in the Oval Office. But I think there are some things that are going to be quite interesting to hear. So please welcome Vanessa Mariah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie.
Oh,
And
I'm
Danny, I love hearing that story. It was beautiful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And actually, it kind of goes into play with the reason why I decided to write this book.
sure.
Although, yes, there would probably be, slumber parties and ice cream sundaes for breakfast if a kid were
That's
president.
okay. That sounds good to me.
um, it's actually the quite like the opposite of what is in the book. I actually saw a need, just like Danny. This is my first published book, but
Congrats.
thank you. Congratulations to you as well.
Thank you.
During the quarantine and the pandemic, there was just so much negativity going on. And I noticed that a lot of kids were getting left behind. Like, they are a lot smarter than we give them credit for,
Mm.
and their voices weren't being heard. And so, one day I was just sitting in a quiet space and decided to write this book to give kids hope and give them a voice. And so I, interviewed my nieces and nephews and I asked them what would they do if they were president? And surprisingly enough, they didn't say, the obvious, like I would, eat cotton candy every day and have recess unlimited every day. They actually were focused on real world problems such as global warming, such as being inclusive and being kind to each other. And so I have nieces and nephews. My nephews are a beautiful mix. I also was raised, my friends like to joke around, they say I was raised with the United Nations because I have every single race in my immediate family. And I know that's a super unique situation and a blessing. But I also realize that that's not how everybody sees the world. And so I wrote this book with keeping in mind, I wanted to give kids like my nephews and kids all around a representation of them. So there's every single color in the book, there's every single religion in the book, and
Great.
it just showcases to kids that they have the power to create their own world despite all the negativity that's going on. They can change, their ideas can change these big world problems, and a lot of the ideas actually that came from my nieces and nephews were practical ideas. So I decided to put it in a book. It's a quick, short read, but it is a great conversation starter for parents and mentors and teachers to, talk about these deeper issues. Not so they don't have to be so aggressive or scared of them. But it's like a gentle way to introduce and
Right.
talk to your little one about it.
And you are raising then a generation of voters, which
Yes.
is fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're great, giving them their civic responsibility early because, like you said, this is going to be their country,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
and their ideas. Too often grown-ups get mired up in the muck, and the kids are much clearer about
Yeah,
what
Oh, yeah.
needs to be done and how it can be done.
Yeah.
for
That's
sure. We
Vanessa,
can.
you mentioned one word, and I've lived by it my whole entire life, and that's the word respect.
Mhm.
And that's what's missing from our entire country today is
Yes.
respect for ourselves mainly. And then if you don't respect yourself, how are you going to go out into the world and respect fellow man?
Right.
And I think respect, and I'm sure everyone will agree, respect starts in the four walls of your home. And
Absolutely.
if you don't, if you're not taught respect at an early life, you're missing out. You're not going to be a respectful person. I'm a firm believer in that, and it's sad, and that's what's happening in our world today. People don't respect each other for a whole lot of things.
Absolutely. Vanessa, is your
Yeah.
book being distributed among teachers for schools and things like that? Because I think it's such a natural for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Down,
actually, it got released during the election, which I didn't plan, to be
I think
honest.
it's great.
I had no idea that it would be finished by then, but I have, connected with a lot of teachers. One third grade teacher actually used it as a lesson.
Ooh,
And so it was really cool, even though, these kids are on Zoom now. I actually got to visit their class and read the book to them. And they did the assignment of what they would do as president. And it was really
wow.
cool to see their answers. So,
what a
yeah, I
great
have.
idea for you to visit classrooms and get to do like a lesson and a book reading and an author visit with kids.
Yeah, no, it's super inspiring. And my goal when I wrote this book was as long as it impacts one child, then for me, I won. I was successful.
Yep.
And the teacher actually, she pulled me aside. She texted me and was like, one of my littles, meaning one of her students, came up to her and said, "I noticed that the presidents look like me." And that was really big for him because he had never seen, a representation of him in such a big role.
Right, right.
And for me, after hearing that, I was like, okay, I'm successful in this because that's exactly what my goal
Yeah.
was.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So do we have another book that's going to come out now that we have If a Kid Were President, or are we going to have Supreme Court justices, or what's next for the backpackmessenger.com? What's going to be the next one on the hit parade?
Yeah, so I'll be working on another children's book. It won't be focused around, politics, maybe something else that would help, keep the mindset of our children healthy. That's really what my goal is to have these little nuggets for them to be okay and comfortable with themselves and let them know that things happen and they can get out of, certain situations. So I don't know. I don't have a timeline on it now, but it will be soon within the year.
I'm glad to hear that. And,
Good luck.
this was your
Thank you.
first book, but I'm glad to hear it's not your last book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations. Now, since this was your first book, did anything surprising happen since it was published? Was there anything about this whole process or anything that was kind of a surprise to you?
It was really challenging. I didn't know what to expect going into it. I actually almost quit before it was published because I, was getting tested a lot. Luckily for me, I had a really great community around me to encourage me.
Fantastic.
Um, but when it comes to promoting, because I self-published, when it comes to promoting and things like that, it is very challenging to do with children's books because parents are extremely protective,
Mm.
which is understandable. So that's one thing I learned. I have trying to get content and stuff for social media. I had to be very, very careful with, blurring out names, blurring out faces. Like, I understand. Um, they don't want their children on social media or anything like that. But it was also difficult for research too. Luckily, I have a big family, so I had enough kids to work with. But I would have loved to. I did get some interviews from some children outside of my family, but I would have loved to be able to expand that. So that was probably one of the bigger challenges.
I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of authors might not realize how difficult that's going to be with children's books. It's good
Mhm.
you have nieces and nephews, you get automatic permission to use their images. But,
Yes.
but yes, it does make it difficult. And, all of these challenges with a first book. Our next author is gone far beyond the challenges as a first book. J.D. Cunegan has written, oh gosh, I'd say at least a dozen books. He'll tell me the exact number on that. This one, The Art of Reading, How Reading Can Help You Become a Better, More Productive Writer. JD certainly knows how to become a more productive writer with book series and all sorts of things in fiction, and now this in nonfiction. So welcome, JD Cunegan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I wish it was a dozen. It's actually more like, let's see, there's 5 books in my series so far. I've got another novel and a thing of short stories, so about 7.
Okay, it looked like
It, there's a dozen more in the works, even if half of them are still up here.
I went to your Amazon
Um,
page and I had to scroll. If I scroll on your Amazon page, there's a lot of books there. Good for you.
um, Yeah, the productivity is hit or miss. We've talked about some other things on here that have hit, and um, her mentioning just now almost quitting. That's I've faced that a couple times myself, and you think it would get easier the more books you write, but it really doesn't. I'm actually finding the more books I write, the harder they get to write because I almost feel like I'm trying to live up to what I've already done.
Mm.
I want I want every book I publish to be better than the last one, but I at least want it to be as good. And sometimes that's a hard bar for me to clear. Um, it was a little different with The Art of Reading because this is my first nonfiction book,
Mhm.
and the idea behind it was so laser focused. You mentioned the Stephen King line earlier. I'm not necessarily a big King fan. I'm kind of hit or miss on him, but I do swear by his book On Writing. And
Absolutely.
when he mentions in On Writing that if you don't have the time to read, you have neither the time nor the tools to become a writer. That's almost like gospel to me. And I've found in my own experiences when I struggle with my writing in terms of I'm not very productive or what I'm writing just isn't that good, it typically coincides with a period in which I'm not doing a whole lot of reading. Um, whether because real life is getting in the way and I just don't have the time or I don't have the energy. But I find the more I read, the more inspired I am to write, the more eager I am to actually sit down at the keyboard and put the words down. And the more apt I am to push through the times when my stories aren't necessarily working for me. So there's a very distinct correlation between read more, write more. Um, I see a lot of people argue, particularly on social media, that you can be a successful writer just fine without reading. And
Mm.
I'm sure there's somebody out there who probably does just that. But I consider them to be the exception rather than the rule.
They're the near
And
misses.
and I'm of the mindset where it's like creativity as a bank account. Whenever you sit down to write or draw or paint or whatever it is you do, you're making a withdrawal from your bank account.
It's good.
Sooner
Right.
or later, you make too many withdrawals and no deposits. You run out of everything. You're empty.
That's
Yep.
great. I like that. I like that a
For
That's a
lot.
for
good analogy.
Hmm.
for me, reading is I'm putting the deposits back into my bank account, and I
Yep.
find I'm at my best and most productive and most creative when I'm doing both, if not at the same time, at least in concert with one another. So I decided I never thought I would write a nonfiction book, but the fact that this is the one that I wrote is actually quite fitting because ever since I published my first book back in 2015, I've self-published everything I've done.
Mhm.
Um, and the self-published and indie author community has been great to me since I've been in it for the last 6 years or so.
Mhm.
So this book is my way of kind of helping other writers. And I tell people all the time, if you're having trouble writing, chances are the answer to your problems is either on your bookshelf or on your e-reader or your Kindle app on your phone or whatever. And I think with ebooks being as ubiquitous as they are these days, you can have an app on your phone and buy Kindle books for $1 or $2 a pop.
Right.
I think there's really no excuse for writers not to also be readers because we don't like to admit this, but sometimes our best audience is other writers.
Oh,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I speak to so many writers, and I want to kind of throw a little flashlight on something you said that I totally agree with. The author community being such a great support of each other. I hear that so often from authors that the community of authors who are out there has been wonderful. And I'm so glad that you thought of that when you were writing this book. If you are any of our viewers, if you're an aspiring writer, please find other writers because really they want to help. if there's any community of people who want to help others, the author can do
And one thing that I stumbled upon when writing this book, and it's something I really deep dive into, is the idea of inspiration. I read X, Y, and Z, and it inspired me to write. Like the television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, in a roundabout way, inspired me to write my fantasy book, Natna. My series, the Jill Anderson series, which is a combination police procedural superhero kind of thing. It was partly inspired by the comic books I read when I was a kid, partly inspired by some of the TV shows I used to watch, like Castle, things like that. So it takes a look at the idea of the stuff you take in whether you're reading or watching TV or whatever, that can in turn inspire you. And sometimes the inspiration doesn't necessarily come from the subject matter.
right.
Over the summer, I watched the musical Hamilton when it dropped on Disney Plus. I'm not into musicals. I'm not really a big history buff. I watched it mostly out of curiosity. I just wanted to see what the big deal was. But Hamilton inspired me, not necessarily from a subject matter perspective. I'm not going to write about the American Revolution. I'm not going to write a musical, because God help us all if I do. But in getting interested in Hamilton, finding out about Lin-Manuel Miranda, and seeing what his creative process is and how relentless he is in his creativity, that is where the inspiration kicked in for me. You can be inspired by real life events. I spend not an entire chapter, but one whole section is talking about taking a look at American history and asking, what if? And sometimes you can get great stories from that. What if John Kennedy wasn't assassinated? What happens then? What happens? What happened if 9/11 didn't happen? What happens if 2016 didn't go the way it did? There's a lot of story threads you can take from that, and there's a lot of work into it. Once you start going down American history, you got to research and do all that. But that's the easiest analogy I could come up with, to where you can go, if I change this one thing that happened, how does that affect everything else? And Danny, I'm a big baseball nut, just like you are. Baseball was the first sport I ever fell in love with.
Right.
So, but as soon as we get off this, I'm picking up a copy of your book and reading that, and it wouldn't surprise
yours.
it wouldn't surprise me if reading your book spins a couple of the gears in my head, because in my day job, I work in college athletics, and I work primarily with historically Black schools.
Okay.
And one of the things we've been doing the past year and a half to 2 years is researching the history of some of these schools, which isn't always necessarily readily available.
Right.
But it's vital history. It's important history. It's history that deserves to be told. These are people who deserve to be recognized for the great things they did.
Yep.
So it's interesting, some of the paths life takes you, and seeing my author life and my work life kind of overlapping like that. It just goes right back to the inspiration thing I was talking about before, and reading can be very inspiring as well as educational for authors.
Absolutely.
It is.
I'm so glad though that you spoke about being inspired and not necessarily copying, because I've actually heard from some authors, and I'll say, well, you have to read more if you want to be a better writer. And people will express that they are afraid that if they read things, that they're going to simply regurgitate it and copy it. That's what the point is. And you expressed it so beautifully, that you're not reading to get a story idea that you're lifting or some such thing, but
Right.
No.
general knowledge. And you said it so well, because I've absolutely heard that fear. I don't want to read because then it's going to kind of taint my mind, and I'm going to have someone else's story in my mind. No, that's not what happens. And you said
The thing about inspiration is, you don't go looking for it. It finds you. So if you pick up a book with the express intent of being inspired to tell a story, that's not going to work.
Right.
Yeah, I pick up books to read because either I find the subject matter interesting or it's an author who I really like. I've got a handful of authors who I will buy their books no matter what they are. All you have to say is new S.E. Anderson book or new R.R. Virdi book, and I'm hitting the buy now button without even reading the blurb.
Right.
Because those are authors who I will read anything they write. They could rewrite the phone book and I'll read it. But
That's a good one.
but
Yeah.
if you're reading a book specifically to get a story idea, it's not going to work.
No.
Right. Yeah.
No,
I know,
and that's
JD, you said you hit the nail on the head when you said when you read, you'll be a better writer. And when I started researching for the Deferred Glory, I started one book because someone told me Shades of Gray was the book, the Bible for the Negro League. Well,
Mhm.
they were almost right. After I started reading Shades of Gray, I found out there was 7 other books that had better stories on these guys and this lady. And I just become overwhelmed, and I read 9 books, and I didn't research. I read them from cover to cover because they were that enjoyable. And one of the guys said to me, "Well, how could you enjoy reading about a lady in baseball?" I said, "This lady in baseball did more for the Negro League than men did. She
That
was
sounds like exactly the sort of thing I'd want to read about.
Yeah, she was a phenomenal lady, Effa Manley. She was a Yankee fan, was a Molinary girl. She grew up in Harlem, and she worked in the millinery fields down in Manhattan, and went to Yankee Stadium and married this guy Abe Manley, who was a very rich person, and they bought 2 baseball teams and became the owners of the Newark Eagles. And she was a pretty strict lady. She told her husband one day over dinner, "Listen, you take care of the monetary end of it. I'm running this team."
Mhm.
And she did. She called every one of those players into her office and told them how to dress and how they were to act when they went on the road to play teams in other cities. And they loved her. And I enjoyed researching her. I wish I could have wrote more on her, but there was no more research on her.
Yeah.
But just what I wrote on her was enough.
And Vanessa, I know your book is more geared towards children, but I think especially a book like yours, I think adults can get
Yes.
inspiration from it as well. I learned some things about myself during the Trump years that I wasn't necessarily proud of about myself. So I think a little bit of that inspiration and that kindness can go a long way.
Oh yeah,
No, absolutely.
definitely.
That's part of the reason why I wrote it as well, just to kind of
It's a
slightly
wake up
trigger
for the adult.
parents and trigger
Yes.
adults.
Yeah,
Just like
Yeah.
Pixar does, I feel like there's
I,
always like
I think
underlying
that's
messages
great.
for those adults.
Absolutely. Underlying
I,
messages. And I just love, even besides the message that you're putting out there, the the empowerment you're giving kids. You know,
yeah,
that you can, I think too often all of us, adults and kids alike, feel helpless in situations. And a book like yours puts the onus back on you can do something about it. And JD, similarly with yours, probably the most common question I'm asked by people who are aspiring writers is, what do I do about writer's block? I am asked about writer's block probably, hundreds of times a week. And you know what? I'm going to tell them to buy your book, because what you
thank you.
do about writer's block is you read. That's what
right.
you do
Yeah.
about writer's block. If you're experiencing writer's block, go and read some more. And that's
Hmm.
going to help you to push through it, because too often people feel like it's this giant monolith in front of them and they can't get through it. And your book and your message, JD, is one of empowerment, that you can take control of this situation by reading more, by feeding your brain, as you had said, by putting in more deposits, shall we say, so that you have more to draw upon. And it is, again, empowering writers, just like Vanessa is empowering children and future voters.
Especially children who've been isolated and quarantined for the past year.
Oh, yeah.
Um, they haven't been in classrooms. They haven't been able to
Yep.
see their friends. Probably haven't been able to see family members who live far away. So I think sitting them down and telling them, here's what you can do, inspiring and much needed.
Absolutely.
I also think even with Danny's book, just giving people courage just by hearing, stories from the past, especially that woman, like
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sure she got so much pushback of, trying to quote unquote get out of line and, speak
She
up
wound up,
as a woman.
yeah,
And
she wound
so,
up being the president of the NCAA in New Jersey. And
right. So she was shattering,
oh
the
yeah,
glass
she was
ceiling.
a fantastic lady. And
And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that the people you write about, Danny, faced, we're still dealing with.
Yes.
oh God, you're not kidding. When I started reading the book, and I knew I was almost born and raised in the South. I went there in the military, but I told Stephanie the story. I was down in South Carolina when I was 7 years old, and my mom was about 6 months pregnant with my brother. And we get on a bus and go downtown to the stores. And I get on the bus and I look in the back of the bus and I see all black people there. Now I'm around 8 years old. I'm not stupid. And I said, wow. And I said to my mother, I said, why don't we go sit back there? She says, sit down. We're not allowed to go back there. So the bus stops and a lady gets on the bus, a black lady who was more pregnant than my mother. Now we came from New York, and I am nowhere. There isn't a prejudiced bone in my body because I grew up with everyone. So my mother tries to give this lady her seat, and the bus driver stops the bus and starts cursing at my mother. And I look, I was scared. My mother said, don't talk to me that way. Said, if I want to give this seat now, the lady says, ma'am, keep quiet. I can't sit here. I'm black. I got to go in the back. My mother told the bus driver, stop the bus. My son and I are getting off. And we got off the bus. And I told Stephanie, I was 7 or 8 years old. I'm going to be 75 in October. That lesson and that thing happened to me a long time ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And it still bothers me when I talk about it because I say, how could people be so mean to one another? But that's how it was back then. It was that way when I was in the military.
And still that way in many.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, I just came back from South Carolina. You know that, Stephanie, visiting my grandchildren, and I saw racial injustice down there driving through one of the back fields.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, God, things haven't changed.
Yeah.
And it's sad. It really is.
No, it is. It is very sad that things haven't changed. That's
Yep.
Vanessa and your book about getting kids to realize that we're putting it in their hands at some point.
Yep.
Things have to keep.
I'm going to buy your book and send it down to South Carolina after I read it.
Oh, thank you.
I love that. I love that. Well, before we close, I want to ask all of you if you have something that you would like to share with our future writers out there. You've all done it. You are, they say 90% of the population wants to write a book. And the three of you, it's like you have climbed Mount Everest. You have accomplished what everyone else wants to, JD several times over. So what would you say as like a tip or a helpful hint for our future writers out there? I'll start with Vanessa on this one. What would you say is something you want to tell a future writer out there?
I would say, the words that I live by is one day at a time. That's
Ooh,
really all you can do is just one day at a time.
I like that. One day at a time. Okay, Danny, what would you say?
I would say don't give up.
Mm,
Keep at it, because everybody has something in them that they could inspire another person with. And
fantastic.
as JD says, the more you read, the more you're going to write. And and I think that's what happened with me. I read a lot, and voila comes the deferred glory. So
Absolutely.
don't give up. And it's a challenge,
Yup.
but it's worth the challenge. And a guy once told me, when I was writing the book, he said, Danny, you might not find a publisher to do your book. He says you put it in a nice binder and you put it in the drawer and you look at it every day when you go after your underwear. And I and,
That's very
and,
funny. That's
and
very funny.
you know, and but I didn't have to live that. So
Glad to hear that. JD, what would you recommend? I know it's reading. Do you have another tip for us as well?
Just put the words on the page. The book is not
yeah,
going to write itself.
Oh, I like
You have to do it. Don't worry about things like, what am I going to do for an editor of book cover? Am I going to go traditional or something? All those questions can wait.
Right,
None of those questions matter if you don't put the words on the page. I'm
right.
not
yeah,
saying you have to write every day. If you feel like you need to take a day or two, get some distance, that's fine.
Right.
Because I'm going to tell you, the vast majority of the books on writing, 90% of what they say, they'll call rules. They're not rules. They're what
right,
that person does.
Right.
right.
Find the process. Find the process that works for you, and write. The
Absolutely.
book will not write itself. You have to do it.
You have to do it. You have
Yep,
to do it one step at a time. But let me just remind
yep.
our viewers of what they're going to be reading this week. Deferred Glory, The Heroes of the Negro Baseball Leagues by Danny Ingellis. You definitely want to catch up on your baseball knowledge if you're a baseball fan. But I must admit, I wouldn't call myself a huge baseball fan, but I loved learning because this is a huge piece of our history that is just not there. And hey, if you're not a baseball fan, it's really good cocktail party fodder, since we're going to be able to start going out a little bit there.
Yeah.
For children and adults alike, because we can never learn enough about this. If a Kid Were President by Vanessa Mariah, what would be different? What would be better? And maybe we can take some hints from it now. And I'm going to do a special shout out to any of our teachers who are viewers right now. If you're looking for a terrific lesson plan, and if you're looking for maybe an author Zoom visit into your classroom, whether it's a history class or social studies or English or something, I have no doubt that if you visit the backpackmessenger.com, Vanessa would be delighted to come visit your class. And especially for all of you out there, since 90% of you want to write a book, please grab a copy of The Art of Reading. How reading can help you become a better, more productive writer by J.D. Cunegan. And also, please visit jdcuneganbooks.com, because there are plenty of books for you to be reading right there at that website. So you can start your reading right now with a whole lot of fiction books and all sorts of things.
And the Art of Reading is by far my shortest book. So start there.
Ah,
you can
okay.
start there, so you don't have to read that much, because he wants to give you that push to get you out there.
Get
And
further.
It's the proverbial first taste.
I like it. Well, to the three of you, thank you so much for joining us here Between the Covers. And
Thank you.
since I did hear that all of you at least have some thoughts about another book coming out at some point in the future, when that
Yes.
next book is ready, please contact me so we can have you back on the show and
Okay.
introduce you and your new book to our viewers. You've been great, and good luck with the new book.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for having me, and JD and Vanessa, all the best. And I will be getting
Well.
your book.
Thanks for joining us on Between the Covers. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're an author who would be interested in appearing on our show, or perhaps you're a member of a book club, we do host book clubs as well, please visit betweenthecoverstv.com. By the way, at betweenthecoverstv.com, You can watch past episodes in addition to learning more about our authors and guests. So sign up there if you would like to be a guest on the show yourself. And if you have some books that you would like to get written or published, visit redpenguinbooks.com. Thanks so much for joining us.